and congregate in JFK Park. Please take a moment to also silence your cell phones before we get started with tonight's events. Now, if you don't mind finding your seats, getting comfortable, and please join me in welcoming to the stage John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee member Kirti Chigurupati to the stage.
Good evening, and welcome to today's JFK Junior Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Kirti Chigurupati, and I'm a first year studying at the college, as well as a member of the Forum Committee. They say every generation is defined by a great struggle. But when that struggle doubles as a political tool and weapon, when the boundaries begin to blur. Social media encourages a modern-day media pipeline, perfectly curating a feed to show consumers only what they want to see. But without exposure to full perspectives, how can people determine the truth? At what point does limiting misinformation become a constraint to liberty? Within the last decade, we've witnessed the mobilization of large-scale political movements like Black Lives Matter and #MeToo through social media. The January 6th insurrection brought into broad daylight how that momentum can be weaponized. We, as young people especially, are susceptible to palatable viral content. And with this susceptibility comes further radicalization and polarization that is hard to unteach. Having lived only in a post-internet world, many of the students here have the same question. How can we determine truth? To provide some perspective on that question, we have with us today a brilliant panel. Dr. Gabriella Coleman is professor of anthropology here at Harvard. She's the author of 2 books, Coding Freedom, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Hacking, and Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, The Many Faces of Anonymous, the latter of which was named to Cricket's Review's Best Books of 2014 and awarded the Diana Forsyth Prize by the American Anthropological Organization. She's also the founder and editor of Hack Curio, a video portal into the cultures of hacking. Dr. Joan Donovan is the research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. She examines internet and technological studies, online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. Dr. Donovan leads the Technology and Social Change Project, which explores how media manipulation disrupts and derails democracy and society. Her contributions can be found in many academic peer-reviewed journals and books, as well as notable media sources like NPR, The Washington Post, and more. Emily Dreyfuss is a journalist as well as a senior fellow on the Technology and Social Change team at Harvard Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy. She was a 2018 Neiman Berkman Klein Fellow, the founding editorial director of the tech news site Protocol, and a senior editor and writer at Wired magazine. She is co-author of Meme Wars, the untold story of the online battles upending democracy in America, along with our next panelist, Brian Friedberg, who is the senior researcher of the Technology and Social Change Research Project at the Shorenstein Center of Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He is an investigative ethnographer focusing on the impact of alternative media, anonymous communities, and unpopular culture on political communication and organization. Our panel today will be moderated by Garrett Graff, a journalist and author, former editor of the Politico magazine, editor-in-chief of Washingtonian magazine, and instructor at Georgetown University in Masters in Professional Studies, Journalism, and Public Relations program. Graff became the first blogger to receive credentials to cover the White House in 2005. Please join me in giving our panelists and moderator a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Monday night. It's a pleasure to be back here in the IOP Forum. As I was just saying back there, I, as a Crimson reporter, covered many IOP forums back in the day and was an IOP study group liaison my senior year here at Harvard. And this is a wonderful place for conversation and gathering of some really fascinating people. Which is not unrelated to the conversation we're about to have tonight. And I am incredibly excited to be able to have the chance to talk with 4 people who know this internet culture world and the morass of the darkest corners of the internet so thoroughly and so well. Brian, Emily, Joan, and Biella. And I think we're going to have a great conversation tonight. We're going to talk up here for about 40 minutes and then open it up for your questions for the last 20 minutes or so. So, Joan, let me start with you, and then I'm going to put this question to Biella as well. Where did the internet go wrong? I started as Howard Dean's webmaster and covered the internet, thoroughly through the 2008 campaign. And back then, it seemed like the internet was going to be a great force for good. It seemed like it was this revolutionary force in politics that was going to democratize the world, that was going to break down the sort of calcified political structures of our country, overturn governments in authoritarian governments in the Arab Spring. And then the last 10 years, it hasn't really turned out to do that. What went wrong?
Yeah, I mean, even the history that you tell of the internet as this expansive space that somehow is the map that covers the territory isn't even the history I teach my students, which is that the internet became what it is through commerce, really. And so we could say the internet became a problem the first time someone bought a pizza on Domino's.com, which is all of these layers of finance that can then get bound up with your identity, right? You have to have a credit card, you have to have a verified system of taking in money, and that layer of commerce online moves us away from this free space of information, and the commerce of the pornography was a big deal at the time, and perhaps has even driven quite a bit of innovation. But I would say, yeah, particularly when goods become transactions online, and then you no longer have the space of, and I'll pass it over to you in a minute, the space of ambiguity, that space of anonymity, you are wedded to and tracked ceaselessly across apps and platforms and search engines and web pages. And as a result, Shoshana Zuboff calls it surveillance capitalism. It could just be capitalism. But by and large, we're dealing with a system that is a bit of a trickster in the sense that it is many things to different people. So it can be at one point, I think about it as infrastructure, social infrastructure. At one point, it can be a liberatory piece of infrastructure for social movements, or it can be the thing that powers your political movement or your campaign. Just met up with Mayor Bill around the corner. You heard of that guy, de Blasio? It's like a big deal, I don't know. He wanted to take a picture with me, so I was like, all right, settle down. I'm kidding. It's my ego getting in the way. But back to reality, it's also the thing that everyday folks plan their kids' birthday parties using, right? It becomes the infrastructure of everyday life. And when it's so ubiquitous, we need to think about it differently. It's not the space for weirdos and queers and music subcultures and foot fetishists. It becomes this thing that we all need. And as a result, the failure to do any policy work that creates those guardrails or those seatbelts or whatever we've designed in the past to make our technology safer for everybody are completely absent from the discourse about the history of the internet, because in 1996 there was a law passed around, a regulation around Section 230, which really absolved product makers from the consequences of their products. And as a result, we've been struggling with that decontrol of the market since then. And I'm, entirely surprised that a company like Domino's doesn't say, well, we don't sell pizza anymore. We sell an idea of pizza that people pay for, and then it shows up at their house, but we're not responsible for food poisoning, right? But that's kind of what's happening with hotels and Airbnb is like, oh, you get bed bugs and all these other problems, not really our responsibility. Or Uber, like, we don't know who or what the safety of this car is, but we're just selling, spots on a map. So anyway, over to you.
Just for anyone who's paying attention, it was actually 6:10 when Joan blamed Section 230 for everything that's gone wrong on the internet, which is the latest Section 230 has ever been blamed for the fouling of the internet.
If you say it 3 times, those kids from the law school come running.
True. Biela, so we were promised hope and change and ended up with QAnon and Pepe the Frog. What went wrong?
I think that Joan covered a lot. I think one way of answering this question is that in the period of time where there was a lot of enthusiasm around the internet as this vector for change, there was also a lot of bad things going on the internet as well, right? There was harassment, there was trolling, there was people who felt like they didn't have spaces there, right? And so part of the story could be told that there was always been kind of problems with the internet at the very moment where there was a lot of enthusiasm, because there were groups, whether it was sort of political parties or social movements, who were really good at kind of taking control of the means and means of production, right? And I still think even today, even though the internet has, in certain respects, has so many problems, it also, for many people, still represents hope and change, right? And so it's kind of, I think Joan said, the internet isn't a single thing, it's a bit of a trickster. And to be sure, there are certain moments where the kind of bad and the ugly are more prominent. But I think at any one era, kind of both are at play.
Mm-hmm. Let me stick with you for another question here, which is, so I want to get into talking about the book that Joan and Emily and Brian have written here, Meme Wars, which I just could not recommend to you highly enough. It's a really fascinating book, and it's, I think to me, one of the things that makes a really great book is that it is surprising but instantly obvious as you read it. And they do a really good job of translating the events that we've lived through over the last 15 years from events that we have lived through into actual history and connecting them. And the title, Meme Wars, comes from the idea that meme wars are culture wars, accelerated and intensified because of the infrastructure and incentives of the internet, which trades outrage and extremity as currency, rewards speed and scale, and flattens the experience of the world into a never-ending scroll of images and words, a morass capable of swallowing patience, kindness, and understanding. And Biela, I want to talk a little bit about meme wars here. And I want to talk about sort of where they start, which is on the image boards, or sort of what we now call the image boards. And I wonder if you could talk about what those are and how these sort of totally obscure sites that most people in this room have probably never been to at all end up coming to dominate and drive so much of our online culture?
Such an important question. And actually, I'll ask, who here has been to an image board? Okay, just a few people. I mean, this is so fascinating because, and I also love the book. It's excellent.
My wallet is in the green room.
No, what's so fascinating is whether it's the meme wars or, for example, hacktivism, which I studied with Anonymous. These image boards, which are so obscure and so many people don't visit, sometimes for good reason, nevertheless have this huge outsized impact on our political sphere, right? So let me just give you some basics. So Some of the more popular or famous image boards are 4chan and 8chan. 4chan was founded in 2003. It was modeled on 2chan, a Japanese image board. They're anonymous, so you post anonymously. Oftentimes the name that's appended to your post is anonymous. You often have to start a thread with an image, hence the image board, but really there's also lots of discussion. Image boards are organized around topics. They're fitness, anime, politically incorrect talk, right? What's really interesting about the image board 4chan is that a kind of collective identity around anonymity grew into being. And in around 2005, there was kind of a growing phenomena around trolling, which didn't just exist on the internet, on the image boards, but there was kind of this accentuated phenomena of trolling, and it was done by this phenomena called anonymous. And the tactics that were used were kind of tactics of disinformation, of harassment, of going after individuals and organizations. And between 2005 and 2008, these campaigns, which often did involve images, but also kind of pranking, were done for no other purpose than kind of enjoyment. And then in 2008, through a very complicated set of events, this name Anonymous started to be used to protest the Church of Scientology. There were other events, and then the name was used for hacktivism. And eventually, Anonymous kind of left the boards, but nevertheless, the boards is where both a lot of meme imagery was used and came into being, whether it was fun cat images. It was a kind of place for trolling. And then eventually, through some events that I think our other panelists will talk about, people started to kind of organize politically more explicitly and hook into kind of reactionary movements. But yeah, it's fascinating because so much cultural material, political tactics came out of these boards. And, you know, I think their power increased once they also left the boards, but in many respects, a lot of the kind of phenomena were generated on these boards.
So I want to do a sort of brief history of the meme wars here, and start with Joan, and then pull Brian in to talk about Ron Paul as sort of the second level of this. But Joan, one of the things that we see that you argue in the book is that this really actually begins on the left, not the right. That this movement begins to sort of weaponize imagery politically around Occupy. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you see this beginning and sort of where, how this starts on the left, and then I'll ask Brian to begin to talk about how this moves right.
Yeah, I think Occupy is really one of the first large-scale global instantiations of a multifaceted, multi-platform coalition of movements coming together using the internet and hashtags as its connective tissue. So there's not a platform at that time that isn't implicated in some facet of the way that Occupy protesters got organized, marshaled resources, and ended up in different public parks all across the world. But what's interesting is when you pull back the layers and start to think about, well, who is at the center of this? There's this great article by Mackenzie Wark that this line from it has always stuck with me about the unions show up to Occupy and they're like, it's great that you're here, I'm your leader, you know? But it was really just lots of anti-media, anti-capitalist, and more like anti-mainstream sentiment of people that were fed up with the mortgage crisis, they were fed up with big banks. That's where you see these mimetic slogans like, banks got bailed out, we got sold out, right? That people start chanting these things and then they become mobilizing devices that draw people in. And so when we started writing about Occupy, I did not want to write another chapter, another book about how Occupy brought all these people together. We really wanted to drill down into well, who were the understudied aspects of this movement? Which fringe groups were being brought together? How are they being mobilized? And that's where I'll pass the baton over to Brian, because we started to talk about Ron Paul and End the Fed. It was the first time at Occupy LA I was standing there thinking, I had my little notepad. I was a little ethnographer then. I was like, oh, I'm going to write about my dissertation. This is so cool. And then I was like, End the Fed, what is that, right? And my only recourse was to listen to the weird man tell me about silver and like why buying silver is great, or go online and end up in Ron Paul forums, which you brazenly traversed for us.
Oh, they weren't really as bad as they're remembered in a lot of ways, particularly Ron Paul 2008. That campaign was really notable for the embrace from the top down of decentralized tactics, of unofficial image making, and of stunts to hijack media attention in ways that were both to draw attention to the campaign, but also to sort of circumvent mainstream media gatekeepers. And for a lot of the Paulites, as they called themselves, the main form of opposition was not liberal media, it was conservative media. Ron Paul was very famous for being anti-war at a time when most people on the right were not. And had a variety of other beliefs that drew in libertarian followers, many of whom also showed up to learn from the Occupy movement just a few years later, and brought some of the slogans and attitudes of the campaign with them to try to recruit and just sort of show solidarity in some cases, and in the cases of people like Alex Jones, sort of hijack the attention economy of Occupy. One of the things that's fascinating is Alex Jones staged at least 2 Occupy protests of his own during the period of Occupy Wall Street. And we think about how the right learned tactics of left organizing. We look to people in our book like Alex Jones, as well as Andrew Breitbart, who, while very critical of the movement, saw its sort of raw populist power and the advantages of decentralized organizing.
So, and Emily, I'll put this to you and then ask Joan to add in some thoughts as well. What does Donald Trump do to the internet as he sort of arrives, and how does he turbocharge what until then had been largely a fringe movement?
Oh, I love this question. And writing the Donald Trump chapter of the book was one of my favorite things I've done in my life. Because Donald, there's a lot of reasons for this, but so all of this infrastructure that we're talking about had created these communities and image boards where people could come and they could take pieces of popular culture, pieces of YouTube clips or memes or any of these things, and share them and decide to come together like, hey, let's use this to get this done. Let's copy Occupy to make this idea happen. And Alex Jones had showed that he could get a huge audience with alternative media. And then you have a character like Donald Trump, who is a well-known historical figure. He is a mythical figure already in a way. Then he is a television star. He plays a caricature of himself on TV, so there are so many hours of video of him. And he had already, before he ran in 2015, become a mimetic figure in a lot of these communities. Exactly, you fired. His hair was already a meme. He stood for a certain kind of New York wealth and power and masculinity to these communities. And then he also swore and was not appropriate and did crazy things. So some of the people in these various communities who don't all have the same belief systems, but do appreciate a transgressive person or an outsider, saw him as really willing to trouble the system and push the limits of the system. And then when he decided to be president, that he would run for president, and he had been trying for some years, these characters were like, oh, he's one of us. He is hella one of us. And so even if they did, one interesting thing researching that chapter of the book was that many of the meme lords who really went to work in 2015, they were riding off the wave of their success of Gamergate, which we get into in the book, and they saw the power that they had with the internet and memes. They decided to put it behind Trump to help him win, but even they were not convinced he was going to win. They didn't, for a long time, think he had a chance. But he was and remains almost the perfect archetype of a meme leader. And he also, because of things that would have hurt a regular candidate, his ability to flip-flop his positions and not have any one opinion that he's 100% held to also really helped him be resonant with a million different communities. People could read between the lines, decide that he was one of them, and then when he started to do better, people online believed that they were the reason, they were responsible for that, which just made them so excited and work even harder.
Bannon.
And this is the other thing, is that operatives like Steve Bannon, who when Occupy was happening, Bannon was watching with his friend Andrew Breitbart and then made a film about Occupy in which he painted the left as this terrible, horrible, violent community. Bannon, Roger Stone, and other like very intense politically savvy operatives had also identified Trump as someone that they should put their money behind, and they understood that he would be catnip to these alternative media systems and to these folks who wanted something different, and so they played them. And so he had support from all sides of that area. Yeah.
So, Joan, Trump becomes this candidate, of the trolls, by the trolls, and for the trolls. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the power that brings when he actually wins.
I mean, so I'll defer to you actually, because you wrote a great article with Whitney Phillips about meme magic and this idea that they were claiming victory, but at the same time, they couldn't believe it was happening. And I think if we remember what was going on in 2015, 2016, it wasn't just that Trump was gaining in popularity and everybody either hated him or loved to hate him or loved to love him in a like God Emperor like way, right? The meme God Emperor about Trump was floating about, and he was MAGA king for some people. But also, media loved to tell a story about him. He was just ubiquitously omnipresent. And when people were talking about the viability of candidates on the left, you had the major unraveling of the DNC. You had the birth of Pizzagate, which is a vehicle for getting people to pay attention to the Podesta emails. So John Podesta's email was spearphished. He was caught, among others in the DNC, talking about preferring Hillary Clinton. There were all of this way in which Anonymous was cast and recast as the villain hero of, showing the light of the Democrat Party. So it was also the case that the Democrat Party couldn't get their ish together and were suffering this major loss of trust amongst other people. And frankly, the people that were backing Hillary would even say, well, she's the best we have right now. And that was a fatal flaw in the Democrats' political strategy. Hillary Clinton was not memeable, nor was she meme savvy. And even when she launched mimetic campaigns online, even with her branding, as my class knows, it's been hijacked by the right. So when she came out and said things like the alt-right or basket of deplorables or wrote about Pepe on her website, it was just like anything online that had to do with Hillary Clinton was incredibly corrosive. And then on top of that, you had some of these debatably influential Russian influence campaigns that were trying to either move people away from voting at all, so towards political apathy, or just away from Clinton, where they would vote maybe down ballot. And so you had all of these other political conditions operating within the culture, but there was a distinct piece of this that Anonymous was really hung out to dry or showed their true colors, and I don't think I know.
Well, I actually want to make a slightly different point, though.
Okay.
But to your question, and just based on what you said, and also what Emily noted, because what I think was so interesting when Trump won was, first of all, I do think the trolls were surprised. But already they had a kind of growing sentiment of distrust of the establishment media. And when he won, it kind of emboldened their distrust because the establishment media missed the mark, which they kind of did at some level, insofar as they weren't going to the rallies, they didn't see the support on the forums. And so it kind of just reaffirmed what they had already been feeling and thinking. And I think another important thing to remember is that while Trump has a lot of support across the generations and very different types of people, some of the people that are in the book are young. They're coming to politics for the first time, right? And his win sort of just clinches their nascent political sensibilities, if that makes sense, right? So there's just this incredible euphoria. And then really just a lot of the dynamics that are covered in the book just take off when he wins, right? Until kind of unite the right, which I think you want to get to.
Yeah, and so that's actually where I want to pick up with Brian next, is that if you can talk a little bit about the alt-right and sort of what it is and why it matters in this story, and then sort of how Donald Trump's victory actually turns out to be the worst thing that could happen to sort of one of his key campaign partners or campaign backers in this.
Sure. In summary, we look back on the alt-right now and look at groups of various kinds of reactionaries. They could be reacting against racial equity, gender equity, and any sort of like democratic function. Some of them wanted monarchy back. Some of them were overt fascists. But there was lots of different subgroups that sort of coalesced under that particular title. Notably, one of the individuals who coined the term, Richard Spencer, actually came from Ron Paul 2012, a disaffected libertarian who was ready for some more radical alternatives and politics that more directly addressed white identity. And that can mean a whole lot of things to a whole lot of people. When we think about like the image boards and how they became organized racists as opposed to just casual racists, you had white nationalist groups, many of whom organized on the Stormfront forums, a historic place for white supremacist organizing, seeded ideas into 4chan, made casual racism funny in ways that hadn't been before, and particularly sort of passed around hate facts, as I like to call them, sort of debunked sociobiology and other sorts of official information that were used to maintain white supremacist power structures but had been debunked over time. So you get this sort of cauldron of ideas, and then you get relatively savvy political operatives who see something perking up in these boards, some kind of energy, people that want to close the borders, people who are critical of things like gender equity and gay marriage, etc. And these savvy political operatives sort of jumped in and were like, oh, well, we are alt-right too. A lot of them really regret that decision once sort of the sheer hate machine of the white nationalist side of this coalition were fighting for dominance, particularly right after Trump got elected. Those fracture lines sort of started right from the inauguration when prominent alt-right leaders were disinvited from official functions, etc. And then leading up to Charlottesville, when only the most hardened of the white nationalists, the self-identified fascists, actually showed up, giving more moderate folks that were part of this coalition something to identify against, thus making them even firmer rooted in the conservative establishment. So the folks who won after Unite the Right were the ones who didn't go. And many folks who actually did attend in the disaster that happened that day regret their decision and ended up regretting their support for Trump, who they feel didn't support them enough.
And yet, sort of from there, that's where I think you begin to see white nationalism really become a much more overt part of the Trump movement, sort of up through present day. And I'm going to sort of skip over a little bit here to wrap up our historical portion of this and come back to you, Emily, to talk a little bit about QAnon and where, which is actually sort of still very much an evolving part of former President Trump's look ahead to his next campaign?
Yes, well, QAnon, we had really hoped when we wrote the book that our QAnon chapter would feel like ancient history and that Q would be kind of irrelevant. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The whole entire movement and the idea around QAnon is still being embraced by candidates, many official candidates running in the midterms, by Trump himself. But one of the interesting things about QAnon is, well, first of all, it was born on 4chan. And that it was able, in some ways, like Donald Trump himself, who could absorb opinions and then lose them and say one thing and then say, I didn't mean that, and it's okay, and that allowed him to get away with a lot of things. QAnon is a conspiracy theory designed to absorb any and all conspiracy theories. And so if you are a conspiracy theorist, or you hate the media, or you're anti-media or anti-establishment in any way, there's something for you in QAnon. And
sell it.
No, but I'm just.
Everything.
Well, and all of those things are
the hottest
all
club
of
in New York City.
All of those things are untrue. But truth was not, an important part of it. And what it was instead was a way to say to people, hey, the mainstream media says Donald Trump is in trouble. They say he's being impeached. They say he's not a good president. The mainstream media is holding him to account, and they are, all of these articles are coming out saying terrible things are going to happen. And the one consistent thing that this group said over and over again was, we know a true thing that is happening that means Trump is actually doing good, that he is actually going to win, that he's actually in charge, that he is not imperiled by this impeachment. That was the main message. And so in some ways, when the alt-right faction fell apart and the leaders of that movement were displaced, like Milo Yiannopoulos and Richard Spencer, into that vacuum, QAnon and some influencers who managed to survive the Charlottesville situation came in to become the network that was pro-Trump. And what we argue in the book is that people have been very confused about what is QAnon. How could people believe this? And how could regular people truly believe all of these crazy things? And some people have said it's like a religion, or it's like a cult, or it's like a video game. And we argue in the book that really it's actually like a media curation tool. It's a media network. It was a way for people to only see the media that showed them that Trump would be okay. And they needed that because he was the person that they looked up to the most. Yeah.
I think one of the things that really comes through to me in the book is the way that QAnon sort of fills in the gaps of the Trump coalition as sort of parts of the pillars of this meme war coalition fall apart. Sort of QAnon expands to fill those voids.
Exactly, and what Trump, at first, if you all remember, refused to acknowledge QAnon. He kind of winked and nodded at them, but enough that people felt in the movement like he was on their side. Because there were some things about it that were so horrible that he couldn't come out and say it, that he supported it. But what we see is that he and his supporters and the people around him understood that QAnon were his core base. And then they kind of culled the overt racism from their ranks. They didn't actually get rid of the racism, but they said, hey, subsume it. Don't be so obvious about it. We don't want to be a white supremacist movement. And by doing that, they enabled Trump to now be much more overt about his support and retweet them and amplify them.
I'm going to ask one final question about the Stop the Steal rally, and then we're going to go to questions. So if people want to start gathering your questions or lining up, we've got 2 mics over here, and give you a second to get to the mics here. Who wants to talk about Stop the Steal and the way that this sort of all ends up culminating in the weeks after the 2020 election and leading up to January 6th?
Well, kickstart it by just maybe lay the infrastructure.
Okay. Well, Stop the Steal, the website was actually registered back in 2016 by Roger Stone in preparation for Trump potentially losing the 2016 election. So the groundwork had already been laid for a very long time. responding to skepticism about mail-in voting and a variety of the other sort of more official concerns that Trump was expressing in, we can assume, bad faith at this point, ahead of time. Lead organizers of this movement started building coalitions with a variety of sort of Christian nationalist groups, QAnon factions, some of the surviving alt-right factions, who went on sort of a tour around the country in between the election and the January 6th. And there was merch, there was all sorts of different crowdsourced versions of how the logo was supposed to look, what it meant to different people. So it got back to that sort of decentralized, web-centric, organizing in plain sight, but having sort of hidden intention that goes back to very early online activism as well. And sort of the political veterans, I mean, Roger Stone himself was very influential with the previous January 6th, the Brooke Brothers riot back in 2000. This time the optics were a little bit different than all those young men in suits kind of, holding up the official processes. This time you had a broader array of factions, many of whom were difficult to control from a top down. And so they didn't really try, the official organizers, Stone, Ali Alexander, they just sort of let everybody riff. So Alex Jones, Nick Fuentes were all sort of the ground troops for this movement, as well as Trump faithfuls in sort of gathering that critical mass way, way before January 6th.
And you see the ones who are most culpable in calling for Stop the Steal, Bannon, Giuliani, Ali Alexander, where were they? Right? They were like, several of them were in a hotel room, right? Because they were not gonna, they knew that what was gonna happen was wrong. And so as we went through all the media and the ephemera and the endless documentation by the Proud Boys themselves and different live streamers, you realize Friday night everybody knows, or Sunday night everybody knows on January 5th that they're gonna storm the Capitol. People are chanting it, it's obvious it's going to happen. And the people who are the ones that organized that chaotic moment and ended with the death of a woman, or 5 people died, police officers have since committed suicide, is that moment of chaos was engineered and organized from the top down. So you have this flipping that happens over the course of 10 years where Donald Trump rises out of the fringes and through the use of resources and political mobilization is able to get into office. And by the time he's in office and he's calling for people to overthrow the government, he is the government, right? And that's where people get into this space of free play around political communication, where they're like, well, Donald Trump was wrong, but it's his right to say it. And that's where we have to also analyze and understand the platforms, the power of the internet to decentralize, to not just raise up those movements that we believe are pro-social or expansive of people's civil rights, or the ones like Anonymous that are critiquing the government, but also that people who are in very privileged places with lots of political power, with very dense networks, can use the internet to incite, right? And so some of our future research, we have a working paper with Kaylee Fagan on MediaManipulation.org about this very moment of, well, what happened to the January 6th rioters? What kind of statements are they making about why they were there? And what we're learning is that a lot of them went because Trump asked them to. Which is to say that there was a clear call to action, similar to when people went to Occupy. They went because there was a time, place, and manner. It was no longer an ephemeral idea, the idea of Stop the Steal. It was do this day at this time. And in that aspect, we have to grapple with of our communication technology, which is how much networked incitement are we going to allow? How far are we going to allow authoritarians to take it? And what are the technologies of liberation and resistance and that we need to build to ensure that equal access to technology just doesn't become an afterthought as we solidify the positions of these platform companies to become their own national security apparatuses, right? Facebook is the first line of defense against attacks against our nation on Facebook. Do we accept that as part of our political anatomy now? And so I have nothing but existential dread for the future of an internet that is not owned by the people.
Yep. And I want to come back and talk more about solutions, but I think we have a question over here.
Is this on? Thank you. Yeah. I'm Kendrick McDonald. I'm a MPP2. Thanks for speaking with us tonight. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some more recent meme usage we've seen from the left with Dark Brandon and the John Fetterman campaign. I'm just wondering if you can share some insight as to what about that usage is interesting. Is it appropriate to draw comparisons to some of the other usage of memes we've talked about tonight? And if there are any takeaways with the Democrats' messaging ahead of the midterms and in the future?
Yes. So Fetterman is running against Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania and has embraced a very online meme-focused kind of calling out of Dr. Oz that a lot of people have been lauding as the Democrats finally entering the meme wars and really realizing the power of these narratives and this infrastructure to win a political race. And we will see if that is what happens. It looks likely. But with Dark Brandon, what we see with Dark Brandon is the co-optation of a right-wing meme, which was "Let's go Brandon," changed and remixed to be a pro-Biden meme that is also playing on a different meme that they tried to get to go viral and didn't, which was Dark MAGA. And then with Dark Brandon, we have suddenly the antithesis of the way the right talks about Biden, which is that he's weak and can't get anything done, and he has no power, and whatever. In Dark Brandon is here to save the day. He has lasers for eyes. He literally can get anything done. And I think one of the conclusions of our book is that it would be wrong to say the Democrats should enter the meme wars, and that's the answer to this. Really, ideally, the meme wars would not be what drives our politics, but it's media that creates politics, and meme wars are a way to hijack media and culture. And so I think that personally, liberals would do well to, if they want to distill their message in a clearer way, memes and mimetic phrasing is a good template for that, because Democrats are sometimes accused of not being able to express that clearly what they stand for, or kind of just being for a lot of different things and not connecting. And what memes do is they're like a shortcut to connection. They resonate because you feel something from them. So Dems could do a lot better, and that is why Fetterman is getting attention, and that's why Dark MAGA is resonating, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we would advise that to be the Democratic strategy.
Because we don't do any advising.
Exactly, and also because, as our book shows, the meme wars of the right have to bubble up from the grassroots, from these fringe communities who have a lot of feelings and agendas, and so it's not actually a top-down political strategy.
Yeah, it's awful when it's a forced meme. I mean, riding with Biden was one of the most cringy. It was just him with his aviators on in a car none of us could afford, right? And it was like, we're riding with Biden. And I was just like, this is a forced meme, right? And so when memes are just part of political campaign strategies because they don't tug on that anonymity, they don't have that transgressive value, it's a problem. And the one thing I'll say about Dark Brandon is that actually, my class just heard me say this, but it actually comes from the far right. It's a fash wave kind of style. And if you look at who else is memed in this way with the laser eyes, before Dark Brandon, it's Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar. And so those aesthetics travel and become unmoored from the anchor of their reality. And that's something that if you're, in the New York Times, you might think, oh, this is something I should write a story about. But if you're a leftist in the New York Times, you'd be like, oh, maybe I don't call attention to that. But it is a story nonetheless that the left has adopted this meme style that comes from the far right. And it's gaining traction. The other thing about memes that's kind of funny is it'll like not happen until it happens, right? There's that, stop making fetch happen, what is that movie?
Mean Girls.
Mean Girls, yeah. There's just like that moment where someone's trying to make something happen and you're like, don't force it.
But just one last thing to add about the Fetterman campaign that I forgot is that a really key component of meme wars, and that we argue in our book, is amplification and adoption by the media. And as the journalist who was writing the book, I was really attuned to that in particular. And with Fetterman's campaign, his meme tactics have been getting a lot of attention. And then that has caught the attention of people on the right, in the far right, and in the right-wing media ecosystem, who have then attacked him and are calling his tactics vapid, which is kind of ironic but doesn't really matter. And then yesterday, Fetterman himself published an article in which he said, Tucker Carlson wants to talk about my tattoos, so let's talk about them. And I was so upset to see that, or it was just annoying to see that headline, because it is again adopting the right's framing of the whole question. And that's when the left enters the meme wars, it's often on the right's terms.
Mm-hmm. So, question over here. I don't think that there's a question over here, so yeah. I'm going to stay on this side.
Okay. I'm Joe Bauer, a faculty failing retirement. So I was thinking, can you help us watch Ken Burns' thing on the Nazis and the rise of the Nazis? And it's certainly, we see many of the same ideas, and we have Father Coughlin. It's not that we haven't seen this politics. Can you help us understand how the internet, going back to the first, how is it that the internet has changed things from, say, the 30s or the 20s? What is it that the internet has done that is uniquely important?
Yeah.
One thing that it allows is just daily participation in a way that I think was harder when there was just radio, right? So when there was radio, there was very powerful messages, people can be drawn in. But if you look at anything from Anonymous to QAnon to the reactionary right, you're literally there making images, maybe launching campaigns, right? With Q doing research as well. And so it is very active and participatory, right? And in that way, it really draws people in. And I also think another element about the internet too, and this really struck me when Joan was speaking, and this is very much part of the meme wars, is that it's bottom up and top down, and the kind of perfect fusion of the two, in a way that I think prior social movements definitely had that, but the top down and bottom up are very, very powerful. So that's one element. I think there's many others as well.
Joan also talks about the commercialization.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. We haven't seen politics, the process of politics making money. I don't think that's.
Oh, online, yes. So one of the ways that someone like Alex Jones is able to monetize his content is he'll sell prepper kits, he'll sell toothpaste, he'll sell supplements. And you see more and more political campaigns moving into online spaces to do fundraising, and you see very local campaigns fundraising at a very national level. The best example of this is probably AOC, which if she was only fundraising locally, probably would not have the cash reserves that she has because of the design of the internet being able to infuse cash in different ways, but because she is better at using the internet than other folks like Elizabeth Warren, for instance. And so AOC is more of a natural fit for this new kind of political landscape where you may have to turn on Instagram Live and while you're cooking, let people know what you did in Congress that day. And that instantaneousness and the scale by which you're able to do it allows people to shift away from being politicians that stage town halls and get to know the people and all the photo hops with the, shaking the hands and kissing the babies, turn into this never-ending grind of participating in the politics and also moving the party along. And what we saw, particularly, there was this very understudied moment in Trump's tenure where he had this social media summit, and he had a lot of people that had not been deplatformed yet at the White House, and they were talking about, if platforms do anything, Trump's coming for Section 230, and all these strange folks from YouTube were in the same Rose Garden together. Of course, it devolved into a fist fight because that many fringe opinions, somebody's gonna throw some elbows. But by and large, what Trump was communicating to the companies was that he values these actors, this is the new media now, and that legacy media is on the horizon. It's not necessarily as important to the campaigns than this direct to consumer media landscape that has been developed through YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and combinations of other platforms and spaces and places. And so I'm very wary that, as historians, we don't want to say, there's anything new here, but there are things that would never have been possible in the 20s and 30s that are just common now.
Let's talk about America first.
We've got 3 minutes left, 3 questions left on the floor. I'm going to try to get all of them in. Up there.
Thank you so much to all of you for your commentary. I wanted to ask, for young people who find it more easy and accessible to get information online, how can we continue to create this accessible political community online, but also curb misinformation and sort of navigate both those things simultaneously?
Emily.
Be skeptical of what you're looking at. Think about the provenance of where it came from, who made it, and what their potential agenda is. Have that in the back of your mind and go forth and operate in good faith.
Down here.
Quick question. In the countdown to the midterms and more importantly the next presidential campaign, do any of you sort of see any budding, trending, important meme leaders, meme narratives that we should look out for that are really going to become the strong kind of stories?
Brian.
There will be a continued attempt by the right to simultaneously build a multicultural coalition and continue to protect systemic racism. That sort of contradiction and embracing that contradiction has been very discursively powerful in social media. So you get sort of one half of the coalition is talking about a race war and the other half is talking about building a multicultural working class that votes Republican. Inside of that tension, there's lots of other political factions that don't really make it into our book that have been sort of bubbling up that in some ways in good faith, in some ways in bad faith, are starting to play with that narrative.
Over here.
Hello. Maybe this is a much broader subject, but I wanted to ask about the artificial manipulation of the internet opinion by the Russians and things like that. So basically, what's your take on what should the government, all the companies should do in terms of regulation or self-regulation to protect the natural debate? Because I'm more concerned, I understand there's an organic discussion that can be like even trolls and things that aren't healthy for a democracy, but at least their origin is organic, right? It comes from activism, from organizing. But I think that another level of the discussion is when it's become from a foreign actor or even national actors, but they create artificial accounts and things like that to distortion and create misinformation. So I wanted to know your opinion about that, and especially what do you think that the government should do to prevent that?
Joan, your 1-minute answer to how do you solve the internet?
I mean, it's up to these companies in particular to put better guardrails in place, to create better information that allows us to spot when that kind of attack is happening. Especially, I was on the phone with Microsoft when I was at your conference, the Certify conference, and they were explaining that they were tracking Russian links to information about vaccines, and they were noticing that Russia was placing links in different countries with different information. Some of it saying the vaccines are safe, some of it saying the vaccines are not safe. This corresponded to Russian allies and non-Russian allies, and they said, well, this seems like something that Bing, which you guys have never heard of it, but I'll tell you it's a Microsoft product that is a search engine. This is something that they've decided is an important way that they can use their tool to understand the topography of the internet. And I think when we think about the internet now, we have to think about it as a tool, a tactic, and a territory. And now I would not say that means build digital borders, although I would say that's kind of where we're headed. Yeah. And we have to fight against that impulse, because nation states protecting digital borders leads us to more sanctioning, more carceral systems, more surveillance. If I could wave a magic wand and get state actors and politicians off the internet, or like make them more visible, I would. But unfortunately, the design of the system itself is the problem. This is what we need to address, and we need to have great technologists matched with excellent journalists and fantastic researchers and anthropologists, public health officials, government folks, really trying to bring forward an idea that it is in the public interest to have a internet that we all want and deserve and protects us all equally. And so that's where I think the vision needs to go, is towards a public interest internet. And before we wrap up, I gotta say thank you to SETI, who has been so good to me over the years here, and thank you to the IOP, because you're the best. So.
All right, well, please thank Brian, Emily, Joan, and Biella. Great conversation tonight. Obviously, a very light topic that we covered the totality of in this last hour. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Garrett.
Thank you, Garrett.